United States, the predominant global economic power since late 19th century, has been shaping the world for over 100 years according to its own values, the most noteworthy ones being free markets, democracy, freedom of speech, and individualism. However hard it may be to imagine that something that's lasted for so long could one day come to an end, we might be approaching the end of American era, entering an epoch in which the world will be different from what it has been throughout our lifetimes. The country that is most likely to replace the US as the world leader is China. China has experienced staggering economic growth in the past few decades, and despite facing some hurdles recently, it still has a decent chance to surpass the US in the next 10 to 40 years. In GDP based on power purchasing parity, China actually overtook the US a few years ago, though in nominal GDP, it is still behind. The question is, what would a world dominated by China look like? Would the people all over the planet actually feel a change? Would it be for the better? Or for the worse? The rise of China as an economic superpower would inevitably lend more legitimacy to authoritarian regimes around the world, because China itself is an authoritarian country. The government policies are decided by a ruling elite, with almost no input from the people. In the past, it was believed that as China's middle class became richer, they would ask for more freedom, and China would democratize. However, as China's economic might increased, its leadership became more and more confident that the Chinese system was superior to the liberal democracies of the West. Therefore, it is unlikely that China will be a more democratic country than today, when it finally surpasses the US and becomes the most powerful economy in the world. On the contrary, China will become an example that portrays centralized and top-down political regimes as better at providing for their people than the decadent democracies that adhere to obsolete principles such as freedom. Authoritarian political movements around the world will be able to refer to the Chinese success story to persuade people, and more countries will fall under the sway of oppressive regimes. In today's world, authoritarian governments have a hard time securing the support of the international community, which makes their power shaky. They have little chance to attract loans and investment, and they can even face sanctions if they go too far. But in the future world dominated by China, such regimes will have much more leeway to do whatever they want. Even today, China provides an alternative source of financial aid, loans, trade relations, and investment for regimes shunned by democratic countries. If China one day has an economy far larger than today, its support for such regimes will also multiply. Moreover, China is already the world leader in surveillance technology with its vast network of surveillance cameras powered by face recognition AI and a notorious social credit system. When it becomes the most powerful economy in the world, China will have the resources to refine these technologies even further, sharing them with other like-minded regimes around the world. Consequently, authoritarian regimes of the future will be more numerous, more entrenched, more confident, and more likely to do things they cannot do today. As China rises to the top of international system, even those living in democratic countries will feel its looming influence. Chinese government hardly has any tolerance for criticism, even if it comes from outside of its borders, and is already quite assertive in suppressing dissident voices in other countries. Currently, the main targets of China's trans-border repression are Chinese people living abroad. However, as China gains more power, there is no guarantee that it will not go after other people as well. Considering that China will probably have clout over many developing countries in the future, a person who publicly criticizes China might have to think twice before traveling to many parts of the world. In a distant future, a dominant China could even bully countries like the United States into extraditing its own citizens for trial in China. Even if that does not happen, a person critical of China might have to live under constant fear of cyber attacks or online slanders perpetrated by the Chinese officials. As a result, a few decades into the future, even an American citizen living in the heartland could be too scared to criticize China. Hollywood already shies away from scenes and dialogues that make China look bad. In a distant future, Hollywood could go so far as to portray China as the perfect country, and make movies praising Chinese military history. Publishers could reject books critical of China to secure their overseas business ties, and even social media platforms could delete content that might affront China. Once China's economy becomes the largest in the world, its next goal will be to sideline the US militarily. To achieve that, it will boost its defense spending. As the Chinese military slowly catches up with the US military, China will become more and more assertive towards its neighbors. It will use mostly economical and, if the occasion arises, military means to intimidate the countries in Southeast Asia, gradually expanding its control over previously contested territory. India will have to step in to fill the gap created by the fading US support and the demographic decline of Japan and South Korea. Arms race, crises and tensions will go on for decades in East Asia. As China becomes more powerful, pollution and environmental degradation are likely to get worse. China is already a top source of industrial waste, but in the present, it feels a degree of international pressure to curb its output. When it becomes the dominant global power, China will have much less reason to consider what the world thinks. Its main priorities will be to maximize its revenues and maintain its economic superiority, and environment will be seen as little more than an annoyance. The waning American economy will mean less funding for universities, and less scientific progress in the United States. China, on the other hand, will be able to allocate far more resources and funding for science, luring scientists from around the world to Chinese universities. Journal papers and patent applications by Chinese scientists will skyrocket. However, the actual benefit accrued from this science will be questionable because under an authoritarian environment, scientists will focus on completing publishing quotas issued by the higher-ups, rather than coming up with genuinely novel ideas. Secondly, some of the breakthroughs that could benefit the public could be concealed from the world to ensure China's technological supremacy. And although this is only a speculation, there is a possibility that certain ethical boundaries would be encroached on in a world dominated by China. For instance, one should remember that in 2019, a Chinese scientist caused controversy after planting human brain genes in chimpanzees. This is the outline of the world you should expect to experience if China ever becomes the dominant global economic power. While all this may look pessimistic, these are merely predictions based on past and current developments. That said, the question of whether China will really surpass the US remains unanswered. For those interested in this subject, in the description I provided links to a number of books I found useful. If you have enjoyed the video and want to see more, please consider subscribing.